Kyle Kondik from the Center for Politics. This is the part one of our two-part American Democracy Conference tonight. Later on, Larry Sabato will be talking to Jonathan Karl about his new book. And this is the 25th anniversary of the American Democracy Conference, so thank you all for coming and enjoying the food and all that. So I just want to briefly introduce our panel, and then we will get into it. Barbara Comstock was elected to U.S. Congress in 2014 and served 2 terms representing Virginia's 10th Congressional District, making her the first woman elected to that seat. Prior to serving in Congress, she served as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and she is a regular commentator on American politics and also a Center for Politics scholar. Miles Coleman is my partner in crime at the Crystal Ball, our associate editor. He is also the author of the just-released America Votes 2021 to 2022, which is an authoritative digest of American election results that has been published continuously since the 1950s. Miles just took that over from our friend Rhodes Cook, who's written in the Crystal Ball a whole lot over the years. So congratulations to Miles on his new book. Tara Setmeyer is a senior advisor for the Lincoln Project. She is also an ABC News political contributor and appears regularly on national cable news programs. Before becoming a recurring figure in national media, she was a longtime communications director on Capitol Hill. She's also a Center for Politics scholar. And finally, Steve Shepard is Politico's senior campaign and elections editor and chief polling analyst. In this role, he serves as the political editor and develops the race ratings that you see on Politico. He also writes extensively about political polling and public opinion, which will be one of the topics we're going to get into tonight, given some of the polling numbers that we've seen lately. So we're, of course, going to get into the 2024 election, but we did also just have an election in 2023 across a handful of states. So I want to start with Miles and then open it up to others. We just had this election. What do you think was notable about it, and do you think it says anything about what we might expect in 2024?
Yeah, well, I think overall we're in a really odd time where, backing up a little to 2022, one of the traditional metrics that people like me and Kyle use to put out our forecasts is the president's approval. Biden's approval numbers now, quite frankly, suck. But the Democrats have, especially in 2022, really held their own. Looking at this year's elections, really the first governor election was in my home state of Louisiana, where the Republican Jeff Landry won outright. So a lot of people were saying, okay, well, is this maybe a good sign for the Republicans? But it ended up being a decent night for Democrats, just like we saw in 2022. Really the banner contest of the night in terms of governor's races was next door in Kentucky, where Governor Andy Beshear, who was a UVA alum, I will say, was reelected fairly comfortably in a Republican-leaning state. One of the things me and Kyle were kind of watching in terms of the governor's races is, kind of with Louisiana done, you had Beshear in Kentucky. In Mississippi, they had a Republican named Tate Reeves, and we were looking at, okay, which incumbent wins by a bigger margin? These are both pretty solidly Republican states, but the Democrat won by a bit more. So that sort of caught our attention. A bit closer to home, one thing that I like about Virginia is we have some type of election every year. So we got, we are really more of a national outlet here at the Center for Politics, but we got a lot of questions about the legislature election. We got a bit of a curveball. The traditional wisdom or the prevailing wisdom going into Virginia was the Democrats are probably going to hold the state Senate while the House is probably more of a toss-up. Well, the Democrats ended up getting a very bare majority in both. Of course, the night was going to be billed as a loss for Governor Youngkin because now he's going to be working with an entirely damn Democrat legislature. But, my kind of hot take was, okay, it was a decent night for the Republicans in Virginia, relatively speaking. They left a number of Biden seats, or at least the Democrats here, left a number of Biden-won legislative seats on the table. So it's I was I was talking to one smart observer the other day, and he's like, "Well, it's interesting that one of the other results that kind of got swept under the rug, I feel like, was they had an election for state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania. The Republicans did better in Virginia than they did in Pennsylvania, which is not really how we think of those states at the presidential level."
Barbara, I wanted to ask you about Virginia, and also, one of the things that really came up in that race was, after kind of Republicans across the country really haven't wanted to talk about abortion in a lot of different places, Republicans did kind of run behind Governor Youngkin on a 15-week, abortion restriction. There's sort of some debate as to how much it, what sort of role it played. But how did you react to the Virginia results and also the issue of abortion, which of course can be so important next year too?
Well, I would agree with everything that Miles said. And I think, in Virginia, we're still dealing with the Trump hangover. When you look back from 17 to now, we, in the State House, in 17, we lost 15 House seats. The first year Trump was in office. We had the whole incident here in Charlottesville, certainly, which was awful. And Trump's response to it was just hideous. So 15 seats then, 6 seats were lost in 19. So we went from 66 seats in the House down to 45 before redistricting, before January 6th and everything there. So just Trump being in office, 21 seats gone and a disaster. So, in 21, when Youngkin came in and there was a little bit of a restoration there and gaining up to 52, that was, a little bit, Republicans were on a little bit of a comeback there. So that was encouraging that there was life for Republicans. But then there was redistricting, so it was a little bit more of a challenge. So the fact that Republicans, we're still a 50-50 state, but it's a 50-50 state if you have normal Republicans. And Governor Youngkin, fairly popular, but you saw last year in 2022 when you had a Republican that was more like Governor Youngkin, Jen Kiggans, she won. When you had 2 Republicans that were more MAGA in the 7th district and the 10th district, my old district, they didn't win. It wasn't, Governor Youngkin wasn't able to go around and say, hey, date this person. When they were MAGA, they're like me. They're like, no, people got it. They're MAGA. When you said, Jen Kiggans, they was like, yeah, okay, that is like you. And I think the same thing happened again this year. The candidates who are more, now if you're in a red district, you can be MAGA, election denier, and have everything else. But for the candidates who weren't in the more normal range, then it became a problem. So I don't know that it was so much the 50, I think if you just look objectively, say like somebody like Carrie Coyner, who her race became a little bit more competitive this year. She's somebody who is very popular in her district. She probably had a tougher race this year than she might have, but she's not an election denier. She's not a MAGA person. She is pro-life, but she didn't, suffer on those issues the way, say somebody like a John Stirrup, who had a close race, but he's a MAGA person. He was in the election denier camp. His wife was somebody who was in the Trump camp in the whole election denying operation. So certainly somebody like that, it was much more of a problem for. So I think when you look across all the elections, certainly in Kentucky, the problem with the Republican candidate was, he went in all MAGA Trump. On his primary night, he was like, oh, yeah, hey, I won the primary because of Trump. Well, the Attorney General candidate who beat the MAGA candidate was the Republican who did the best statewide on election night. So Republicans do have a future because the Attorney General candidate decided to go out and beat MAGA instead of join it. And he won his race and, did a great job. So yes, Republicans in Kentucky have a future. But I do a little bit of work in Kentucky. You could see that Andy Beshear was going to win right from the beginning because he was moderate, great. Every time there was a disaster, he was out there. Just great candidate and just great future. So and just beat MAGA. And so, kudos to the AG candidate who didn't lean into that. And then, particularly in Mississippi, too, MAGA came up short there, even though they won. So, MAGA is a killer. We'll go into that on 24, but MAGA's been killing Republicans, ever since 17, certainly in Virginia. So, the fact that they even got as close as they did, and I think it shows even with a popular governor with a lot of money, MAGA is still a hangover that's hurting Republicans even in Virginia.
And just piggyback on that really quickly, I was talking about really this year being an extension almost of the 2022 elections. I remember after last year's elections, we were looking at kind of the differences between some of the races, and one of the key states last year was Georgia, and you had Brian Kemp, who was who is a Republican but not a Trump Republican. Was reelected comfortably over Stacey Abrams, and in the Senate race, you had Raphael Warnock, who was reelected over Herschel Walker, very much a Trump Republican. And kind of looking at where Kemp did better than Walker, someone who follows me online is like, man, there are a lot of voters, specifically in the suburbs, who are just dying to vote for a normal type Republican, not a Trump Republican.
This is your brain on drugs. Questions?
Steve, it looked like you
It's
want
an
to
old
jump in.
commercial. You guys don't know that, right?
Miles made an interesting point about going back to 2022, and I've been thinking about this, looking at this year in Pennsylvania and Virginia. It seemed to be a continuation of a trend we saw in 2022, where Republicans actually made pretty big inroads in some blue states. We had elections in, nobody looks at California, but we had elections in California. Gavin Newsom's first election in 2018, obviously the 2020 presidential, 2021 recall, and then in the 2022 midterms, his margin dropped pretty significantly. Republicans made these inroads in New York. All the new Republican members of Congress. Part of it is a congressional map that was drawn with court oversight and not by a partisan legislature. But part of it is they won in places where Donald Trump had done terribly. We didn't see that happen really in swing states for most critically. John Fetterman won by 5. Josh Shapiro won by 15? And we saw that happen again in the state Supreme Court race in Pennsylvania. So I'm interested to see whether this all gets sort of, this kind of reduced polarization a little bit, gets erased when Donald Trump's on the ballot. If Donald Trump's on the ballot in 2024, and we'll talk about the swing state polling, I know you want to get there. Or if we kind of see these inroads, and whether that's normal Republicans versus Trump Republicans, or whether it's states where abortion rights would be under threat, or states like New York and California where it wouldn't, even if a Republican were elected governor or to other offices. We'll see how that all plays out. But that's been striking to me over the past 13 months.
Tara, if you want to say anything about 2023, go ahead. Okay,
yeah,
go. Yeah.
I think there's something that's missing here. So what happened in Virginia, which was the bellwether, I'm a Virginia resident now. I'm also from New Jersey, so I pay attention to what's going on there. Because the New Jersey governor's race last time around was really, really, really close. A lot closer than people expected. So there were eyes on what was going to happen in the New Jersey legislature as well, because there has been a groundswell of MAGA in Jersey, particularly in South Jersey, down the shore areas, and South Jersey. I'm a North Jersey person, so I'm a little biased. But ultimately, New Jersey did stay blue, and Democrats won seats because there seems to be, to Barbara's point, MAGA fatigue in parts of New Jersey. And then there were and the governor's actually been doing a pretty good job there. Here in Virginia, which I was watching very closely, along with Kentucky, I've been at events with Andy Beshear, and he is an excellent candidate for Democrats. Democrats in red areas need to take a page out of Beshear's book, because he was able to, not only is he a legacy guy there in Kentucky, so he has established relationships. I mean, politics is still local. Those relationships go a long way. He was also running against someone who had a lot of problems. Daniel Cameron was problematic in a number of areas, whether it was as AG, what happened in Louisville, or the sexual harassment allegations in his office and how he handled them, and then obviously his allegiance to Donald Trump and some of the things that he carried on about, and particularly abortion. In Virginia, the abortion issue was huge. And a lot of national Democrats, I hope the party paid attention to what happened here in Virginia. If you, like me, watch television, you saw that almost 99% of the Democrats' ads were about the extremist position of Republicans on abortion. And 99.9% of the ads by Republicans were about crime and fear of the other, and some of the things that were funny to me, some of the messaging, because they really didn't have a lot to go after the Democrats on this. I mean, there's in some areas, there's, pockets of crime that are rising, but, allies of so-and-so would name the candidate, right? He's like, his allies voted to defund the police. Like, they had to do 3 people removed to try to tie it to that candidate. And it was absurd. And the doom and gloom, very, I don't know, Truth Social type of, the brown menace is coming to get you, and your gated community commercials were ridiculous. And I think a lot of Virginians saw through that, thankfully. And in, where I live in Northern Virginia, I was watching very closely, because those are the areas that will make the determination going into the next election cycle, what's going to happen in Barbara's old district. And we see in District 7, I believe, Abigail Spanberger's district, she's not running again. What's going to happen there? Because those are Biden-won districts, but they're up for grabs still. What type of candidate? Candidate quality matters. If you, in Pennsylvania, the example you used, the reason why Josh Shapiro won and the reason why Fetterman won, as impaired as he won because Mastriano and the other candidate, they were MAGA lunatics. And people saw this and they said, no way. We can't, no. The good people of Pennsylvania said, I don't care if he had a stroke and can't put a sentence together. He's better than these people over here, because MAGA is dangerous, and we don't want that here in Pennsylvania. So candidate quality matters, and that's what I'm looking for going into 2024, with Trump being at the top of the ticket in these places. If you notice that the MAGA candidates, they can't win statewide for the most part. And when you look at these swing districts, these swing states, will Trump be a drag down ballot again? Because he has been a loser for the Republican Party ever since 2016. That was the last time he's won anything, and ever since then he's been an albatross electorally.
No, he'll totally be a drag in
Oh, yeah.
Virginia and everywhere in all those swing states.
Yep.
Yeah.
But, and yet the party still backs him.
Well, one, and I'm going to direct this to Steve, but obviously others can chime in too. One theme of the last month or so of the polling has been that Joe Biden's numbers are really bad. His approval rating is down, as Miles artfully put it. He's losing to Trump in a lot of the national polls, granted by small margins, but Trump is probably polling better than he ever did in 2016 or 2020. There's this debate among people who follow the polls as to how seriously we should take them right now. Steve, what you follow this stuff, you analyze these polls. What have you thought of all this stuff?
Well, I think it gets to Tara's point about candidate quality, and the Democrats are grappling, I think, now with the quality of their, likely nominee who's currently sits in the Oval Office. I think all of those points that you made are true. The one thing I would underscore is that Biden's numbers have gotten demonstrably worse even recently. I went back and looked at about a dozen polls that came out this month where there was a recent trend line, whether that went back a week or two, whether that went back a month or two. And in the 13 polls that I looked at last week, Biden's position was worse in 11 of them. That's not unanimous, but it's pretty close. His approval rating's down about 2 points over the past 2 months. Donald Trump's average vote share in the polls is higher than it's ever been, and is up about 2 points in the last 2 months. All of these are kind of flashing red indicators. Now, it's true that Democrats have had, over the past 13 months, better election results than you would expect, given Joe Biden's position in the polls, but I think it's difficult to ignore the polling right now that suggests that he's behind in a race that quite frankly, he never trailed and led comfortably for a lot of 2020 until people voted and it was a little bit closer. But it's hard to look at using a lot of the same techniques and getting numbers that look very different from where we were in the run-up to the 2020 election.
But
a good
today
thing.
there was a poll that had him up, and also in the crosstabs, when Trump, and it won't be if, when Trump is indicted, the crosstabs show convicted, which in D.C. and prosecutors such as Chris Christie, but kind of any other reliable prosecutors will tell you it'd be pretty hard not to get convicted in D.C. on the charges he's been faced with, because every witness in the January 6th charges will be Republicans, starting with Mike Pence, Mark Meadows, Bill Barr, senior Justice Department officials, his White House counsel, senior White House officials, perhaps even his children, his senior campaign officials. So there will be no Democrat witnesses against him. It'll be every named Republican official you can imagine, plus documented, real-time, documents there to corroborate all of the things that they will be questioning them on, and likely somebody who will be taking the Fifth Amendment before he's convicted. So when he's convicted, then, those numbers dramatically shift. So faced with a convicted nominee, if he's indeed the nominee, those numbers do dramatically shift, particularly in the swing states and with the key demographics of people who you need to win in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the other swing states. And, which often gets ignored too, to win a campaign, you actually have to run a campaign, and those swing states do not have active Republican parties with money, because Donald Trump has been basically bankrupting the party in all of those swing states, and many of them don't have any money, essentially no money, and any money that's there, he's basically wanting to get his hands on to pay his lawyers, not to run a campaign. So even in Virginia, as well as we did this year, one of the reasons, Republicans say we didn't do better was we were outspent. Now, we were outspent with a millionaire popular governor in Virginia. We are not going to have a millionaire, Donald Trump, whether he says he's a millionaire or not, we will not have a popular millionaire guy who's going to raise the kind of money that will be out, that we're going to have more money than Biden. Biden has so much more money than Republicans are going to have in next year's election. So all of those factors make for a very different dynamic that has not been accounted for in all of the polling that you've seen so far. So running real races makes a real difference when you get out there on the field, and when you see all the ads, and when you're going to see a lot more ads reminding you of the convicted guy who might be the nominee, which is why if there's a different nominee, the different nominees all do better than Donald Trump, whether it's Nikki Haley or somebody else, who Nikki Haley does do better than any of the others.
Well, there's a reason why they say polls are a snapshot in time, right? And it's a good thing that the election isn't today. The election is a year from now. It's just like in a football game. They don't call the game at halftime. It's a good thing. So we're at about halftime right now. And what's interesting to me through this whole thing, and to Barbara's point, is that people really aren't completely considering that Donald Trump will be the nominee. I think there's a lot of denialism going on in the country. There's Trump fatigue, right? I mean, imagine how we feel. We live and breathe this every day. And for the average person, it's everywhere all the time. And a lot of times people they're like, we don't care. Yeah, Trump does crazy things, and it's the deep state, or it's just they're out to get him, but he's not going to be the nominee anyway, or he's going to be in jail. No, Donald Trump, short of the Lord taking him, will be the nominee next year. It doesn't matter if he's convicted in all 4 cases. He's not going to jail. The way our system works, he will appeal until the cows come home. That will not happen. He'll never see the inside of a jail cell before next November, as much as I would like to see him there, and I think he deserves to be there. But now, convicted, sure, okay. But in the states that matter, and there's only a handful of them, it will be Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, maybe Georgia. That's it. And about 250,000 votes that was the difference between 2020 and Donald Trump winning or losing. That's it. There were about 250,000 votes combined in those swing states. This is going to be an incredibly close election. And people now that are looking at Joe Biden, who's actually done an excellent job as president, and this is coming from someone who was in the Republican Party for 27 years, who worked very hard to make sure Joe Biden and Barack Obama did not get elected the first or the second time, but voted proudly for Joe Biden in 2020 because he's a good and decent man. My policy differences with him don't matter. He's not an election denier. He's not an authoritarian. He's not an illiberal, populist, nationalist, neo-Nazi, fetish-having lunatic. And that's what we're facing. That's the choice, people. It's a binary choice. Okay? Well, I'll take the old
What
guy.
she said.
Right?
Well,
I'll
you
take
know,
the old guy.
I
That's
think it is-
pro-democracy over the lunatic old guy who's not.
I think it is fair to point out about the stakes is that, like, are Democrats making a mistake by nominating Biden again, given how high the stakes are and given what the numbers look like?
No,
now?
he's the only one who's beaten Donald Trump. Why would they risk that? Now, I think that they made a bit of a mistake when they chose Kamala Harris as his vice president. That I understand why they did that, but I don't think that they were thinking long term at that point. They were like, let's just get through the election. And if there had been a stronger vice president, we can have that's a whole different discussion of why she isn't. But she is a drag on him right now. And that is partially why a lot of the middle of the road Republicans who are gettable, right? And here at the Lincoln Project, we call them Bannon line Republicans after Steve Bannon, because he told us in 2020 that if between 3 and 7% of Republicans either stayed home or voted against Trump, he would lose. So we said, hold our beer, that's who we target. That line, because of the Dobbs decision and abortion, is, we believe, and our data shows, it's expanded to 7 to 11% and up to 20% depending on the state because of the Dobbs decision. And so that has changed the dynamics for a lot. Women are going, no, we're not trying to live in the Handmaid's Tale, and we don't want our grandmothers having more rights than our daughters did. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And a lot of men, too, are saying there's something wrong with that. So that adds a different element here to that. But those gettable Republicans, those are the people who are going to make the difference here. And, Kamala Harris makes some of them uncomfortable. We talk to people all the time for the Lincoln Project who say, yeah, but what if something happens to Joe Biden? And then I'm like, listen, again, it's the same argument. Whatever problems you have with Kamala Harris, she is not an illiberal, populist, nationalist, neo-Nazi fetish-having lunatic who wants to tear up the Constitution. So you have to think about where, put it in context here. And so, we'll see. So I don't think it's a mistake for them to go with the guy who's proven that he can beat Donald Trump and who's actually doing a good job on the economy, on foreign policy, on what he did after COVID. All of these things, they need to figure out a way to break through on the messaging instead of stop constantly going on and on about the fact that he's old. Yep, he's old, but he's sane and competent.
Something I'll add on to her point is just about the idea of Democrats kind of dumping Joe Biden is that, well, I think there's something to have an incumbency, just
Yes.
the office
Correct.
of being in office. Although, we were talking about some of the other elections earlier that the Democrats have been kind of doing well in. Meantime, Biden isn't popular. I have a friend who just, okay, well, kind of the logical outcome of all this is Biden loses, but we have a very Democratic Congress. I don't think that's going to happen, but
Well,
I thought that was a
it
good
is
thought.
possible, and we did see in 2020 that Biden generally did better than Democratic congressional candidates. I mean, it was close, but you almost wonder if you could see some sort of reversal of that or a different kind of trend.
Well, yeah,
Steve,
and
I think you want
that's why Trump went crazy, because the Republican candidates did better than he did, and he's like, how could I have lost?
those
when they all
elections
did?
weren't rigged.
Yeah, those were
were
legit.
whatever.
Legit.
Yeah,
Those are legit.
Steve, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that Democrats are in the Biden campaign. They're actually, we don't see it here, whether you live in the Washington market, you don't see these ads, but they are running a pretty active campaign in the swing state, mostly around selling the president's economic and legislative accomplishments. And it doesn't seem to be working much. He spent about $1 million a week dating back to the middle of August in the 6 states that Tara mentioned, plus North Carolina. and it's not really moving the numbers. Swing state polling looks a lot like the national polling. So, maybe that it's time for that message to change. Maybe it needs to be about the
Gas prices
threat-
are down. Prices
but it's-
are
Either that or shift to the threat that they see Donald Trump posing to
Right.
democracy, or the threat that Republicans would pose to abortion rights at the federal level. Like, maybe that message shifts, but right now the message has been about the economic record, infrastructure, other legislative accomplishments like
It's going to
that.
have to be a negative. When the campaign is about Trump, because
That's right.
you don't see Trump right now. You haven't seen Trump. When it's negative, if the campaign is about Trump, Trump loses. I mean, you can't, if the campaign's about Biden, that's not going to work. I mean, everyone's used to Trump not being in your living room anymore, which we all love, right? Who wants him in your living room again? I mean, I know my husband who's voted Republican all his life until 2020. When Trump's on TV, it's like, why is he on TV? Why do you have that on? It's like, well, I do some commentary too, so I have to have it on. I got to watch this speech because I have to talk about it. He goes, okay, I'll go downstairs. But he just doesn't want him in the living room again. And that is the feeling of so many people. So those Republicans who are going, and independents who are going to vote against him, they're going to be bombarded the way Virginians were this year on all those ads. And you're going to see that horrible orange face again. And you're going to see all those horrible things he says. And you're going to see all the Republicans who have said you're going to see John Kelly and what he said about him. You're going to see what Bill Barr said
hope
about
so.
him. You don't have to see, I mean, if the Biden campaign is smart, you're not going to see what a single Democrat has said about him, because the worst things said about Donald Trump have been said by the people who worked for Donald Trump. You don't have to have a single Democrat say anything about him, because the people who feel the strongest about Donald Trump never being president against him are the people who worked the closest to him. Not, those are the people who
There's a
feel he's the
tangible
most
example
dangerous.
of what you're talking about and what you're talking about, because the Democrats, I think, were running an old playbook, and we often say you have to play the game you're in, not the game you wish you were in or the game you used to play before. You have to play the game you're in. And some of the old school tactics of messaging aren't breaking through because they're old school. Things have changed. People's attention spans are different. The way we communicate is different. And there is a right-wing ecosystem that is very well funded and very well coordinated going on outside of the circles that the mainstream and those of us who watch mainstream or read mainstream media and listen to them is going on outside of that. And it's something that the left of center world just doesn't come anywhere close to competing with. So that is an element that's been growing and expanding as far as the way information is consumed by voters that the other side is at a great disadvantage of. But something that I think the Biden administration, the Biden campaign is catching on to, which is something that the Lincoln Project has done, and we've been very good at doing this, is that we'll take the quotes of people who are close to Donald Trump. We'll play that audience of one kind of game with him to freak him out and make him do crazy things and remind people that he's a nut. But they did this on Veterans Day. They put out an ad on Veterans Day with Donald Trump's quotes disparaging the military. And it was an excellent ad. And we finally said, yes, they're getting it. That's what they have to do. They've got to go for the jugular on these things so that people, like hardcore, stop worrying about if you're going to offend anyone or focus grouping 25 times. Take what Donald Trump has said. Like I always say, don't take it from me. Trump said it himself. It's right here. And inundate people with those messages. Political repetition creates reality, and it affects people's behavior. And I think they're starting to get hip to that and realizing that, all right, we're really going to have to, go for it here.
I mean, and the biggest threat for Democrats is, what if somebody besides Trump is the candidate? That's going to be the biggest problem.
Then
Because
we-
they are assuming that it's Trump, which I do too. I mean, most people do.
Yeah.
But right now, there is a little, there's an outside chance. I mean, Iowa does do some things that can be different.
And it hasn't
today, the Koch folks, did come in and endorse Nikki Haley. So there's a little bit of an upset there. And the religious right folks are gone in for DeSantis. And so if there's some kind of upset there, and if something happens there and all of a sudden the Orange Emperor has no clothes, and everyone wakes up and says, "Oh my God, he is the freak that we all know he is." And then there's a real meltdown because he will fall apart at some point. And then if people really do see it, I don't think it's going to happen because you keep thinking it has to happen and it doesn't. So,
Didn't Mike
you know,
Huckabee,
here-
didn't Mike Huckabee win the Iowa caucus one year?
yeah.
Yeah, I was had a
Was
very
Mike Huckabee the-
very
Santorum
poor record.
did too.
Santorum and Ted
And
Cruz.
Santorum, Cruz,
Yeah, but if
right? It
there's-
does. Iowa doesn't
Yeah, if
matter.
there's something that happens there, and then Chris Sununu comes in and endorses, Nikki or somebody in New Hampshire, and then he loses a 1-2, and then
he wins by 50 in South
and then you
Carolina.
go into South Carolina, and then okay, they all come in and endorse him, and then Tim Scott endorses him, and South Carolina gets saved, right? But if something happens, and if there's a meltdown, and if Mike Pence comes in and decides to say, finally he'll say more things. Stranger things can happen. Okay,
Who's
I
listening
know-
to Pence?
yeah, some kind of Hail Mary.
5 people at the pizza shop in Iowa?
Yeah, I
Come
know
on.
it's not going to happen, but that's the biggest threat, and I know it's a smaller threat than anything else, but that is the biggest threat where something could happen, because I think what's more likely is Nikki starts rising, something happens, you think it might everyone might come in, and then Trump goes full misogyny, and as Tara knows better than the guys here, unfortunately our party does have that great misogynist streak, and then that misogynist attack that Trump goes full on, and then DeSantis
And race
joins
too.
in on.
And race.
will
Don't
help
forget,
Trump.
she
And
is
then-
of color,
Yeah.
and he'll make sure all of his people are
Yeah,
reminded of
and
that.
then that all works.
And then
to
she'll
Trump's
apologize for being of color and for using her name Nikki instead
being
of
a
the real one,
woman,
because
and
she
then-
straddles the fence so badly on everything.
Yeah,
No one
yeah.
believes anything Nikki Haley has to say. She'll say that the sun rises in the west if that's what she thinks people want to hear. So that's Nikki Haley's biggest
Yeah.
flaw. She's
I mean,
so wishy-washy.
it is kind of odd to be here late November before the presidential election cycle, and like the primaries just they both feel like just dead. That there's just not a whole lot going on. I'm glad Barbara brought up the Americans for Prosperity, the Koch back group endorsing Haley today, but it's just Miles, like, I mean, are we right to just be sort of dismissing these primaries, or like, do we have potential here for some sort of upset?
Yeah, well, I was looking at scheduling a vacation maybe during the primary. No, but it's. I think you were writing about this, Kyle, in one of your articles, where this could be the first time, like in modern presidential history, where both sides' nominees win every primary on their side.
Thanks for citing me. I appreciate it.
Sure.
A great coworker.
Yes. But I think that's definitely a possibility.
Steve, what do you think?
I do think you really have to go
actually-
back to 2000 to find a race at this point where you kind of know who the candidates are going to be. And I've been thinking about this and wondering how to look at some of the general election polling, which, you can go back and do the old sort of poli-sci study and find that it's not predictive at all at this stage of the election. But how often do we actually know who the candidates are going to be at this stage of the election? And we probably know who the candidates are going to be this time. That said, one of them could be convicted of multiple criminal charges between now and election day, and that's never happened before. There's a very small set of folks who work at universities in poli-sci departments know this better than anyone. There's a very small set of presidential elections, and trying to draw some sort of statistical power by taking them collectively, especially in the modern era, is kind of foolish. And so, these primaries do feel pretty sleepy. I tend to take more, I don't know if it's optimistic necessarily, but I tend to let the voters tell me things more, just in terms of my general philosophy about how I do my job, than try to prescribe to them. So I'm eager to hear what folks in Iowa on what is undoubtedly going to be a cold and probably snowy night on Martin Luther King Day and January 15th have to say. And then 8 days later, I want to see what New Hampshire voters have to say in both parties.
And even in 2000, which was Al Gore won every single contest as the sitting vice president.
But New
And-
Hampshire
and-
surprised us on the
Right,
Republican
and
side.
George,
Right.
New Hampshire, voted for McCain by like 20 points or something.
right.
Now George W. Bush still ended up winning, but I guess I'd maybe be on guard for that just a little bit. But again, and others can jump in on this. It does feel kind of sort of odd. And Steve and I were just talking about this before the panel started. Like, it feels so set that something's going to happen to mess it up, to like scramble things up. And like, that's not.
Like a war in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I don't know, or you know, with older presidential candidates, some sort of health problem or whatever, and
I
you
think
know, you just.
Jonathan Karl will have more good stories. Like
I'm
he
sure.
had today. I trust
I'm sure that he will. You know, also, it looks like it's going to be a fairly full ballot, at least in a lot of different states where you've got a number of different third-party candidates running. You know, I don't think anyone gives any of those candidates a chance to win. But what role do you all see the third-party candidates playing in this race?
Spoiler, no third party has been successful or come close to it since Ross Perot. And Ross Perot, who did he cost? He cost George H.W. Bush the presidency, right? Bill Clinton won only 43% of the popular vote. This time around, I mean, I understand, because as someone who's now politically homeless, I would like to see something else. I think the Republican Party is irreparable. It needs to burn to the ground. And one day, maybe I'll be part of that right of center group of normies, along with Barbara, to help build it back up again. But in the meantime, those of us who feel politically homeless, it's attractive to have a third party option, right? Well, they're not too right, not too left. Big, third party sounds great. Except in our system, it doesn't work now. And there has to be considerable structural changes over a long period of time for that to change. We're not Europe. We're not parliamentary system. And so it's a two-party system. And the no labels groups that are out there, no labels in particular, very well funded. They're selling people a bag of goods here that is not feasible. There is no path. No labels is funded by a bunch of dark money Republican billionaires like Harlan Crow and others. And any effort they put forward will help Donald Trump win.
Yeah.
Period.
Do
And
not
so,
be sucked in, do not flirt.
Yes, please, please.
Pasco.
It is a binary choice. And in 2016, I actually voted for Evan McMullin. I voted a vote of conscience. I will not do that again. I would not do that again. It's too consequential this time around. So the third-party candidates now, I mean, who do we have out there? Dean Phillips. I mean, unfortunately, you always have people that have vanity candidacies. They have a lot of money. They've got consultants that stroke them and think that they have a chance, and they get bored. So they go, yeah, let's do it. We can do it. Okay, he poses no real threat to Joe Biden. Cornel West and some others, Robert Kennedy Jr., like this guy. Again, it goes to people just desperate for something else, that's where they go. I mean, he's another person that's a little bit loony, and the fact that he decided to try to run as an independent, I think, was actually stupid of him, because it's more difficult for ballot access. He should have gone Green Party or whatever, but because at least they have ballot access like libertarians do. But I will say that in the close states like Arizona, where it was decided by 12,000 votes, a little bit less, Georgia, decided by less than 12,000 votes. Wisconsin, decided by 22,000 votes, roughly. It could matter. Jill Stein cost Hillary Clinton the election in a couple states. So we have to be careful with that. But the idea of the larger no labels kind of idea, no bueno.
Steve, Tara was talking about the third-party candidates maybe hurting Biden more than Trump.
But RFK Jr.
RFK
hurts
Jr.
Trump.
might be different than I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's probably true. I think right now you look at RFK Jr. and when you ask poll respondents, he seems to draw from both Trump and Biden equally. But when you look inside a lot of those numbers, you see that Republicans say they like him a lot more. Now, Republicans also like Donald Trump more than Democrats like Joe Biden, so it's hard to know how that all plays out. I think collectively speaking, though, if you do have Cornel West, Jill Stein, there'll be a libertarian candidate. Libertarian typically is the best performing third-party candidate on the ballot, at least.
And strangely, very little talk about the libertarians.
Yeah,
so far.
in the last.
I mean, they'll have someone, but you're right.
Yeah, no.
That's
And then
Ron Paul, really.
when you
right?
we talk all about Jill Stein, but when you look at the Green Party and the Libertarian Party candidates in recent presidential elections, the Libertarian usually polls 2, 3, 4 to 1 more than the Green Party candidate does. But Cornel West, Jill Stein's running again.
Marianne Williamson, too, right? Isn't she
She's running in the Democratic primary. But if you do see a Joe Manchin or someone like that, I think taken collectively, when you look across the third-party spectrum, it does seem to line up to draw more from President Biden than former President Trump. Obviously, if some of these folks, if Joe Manchin doesn't run, or No Labels doesn't field a candidate, as they say they're going to decide in the spring what they're going to do, then maybe that changes the calculus. But right now, I would look across these folks and say they're more likely to threaten President Biden's support than former President Trump's.
Miles, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, and I'd say in terms of like something about third parties generally is, me and Kyle have seen this more in statewide races, but third party candidates will almost always poll more than what they get on election day, which I think from a forecasting perspective, makes it a little harder for us because, okay, until election day, there may be, 3, 4, 5% of the vote that's blocked in RFK Jr.'s column. He's probably not going to actually get that. But that said, I think Tara is good to bring up the point of ballot access because you always have to talk about it, especially when it comes to something like No Labels where, okay, well, they're not in every state. I was doing a story recently with a reporter out in Oregon. They just got ballot access there, which, okay, that to me, that doesn't really matter too much because Oregon is a pretty blue state. But I saw afterwards they also have ballot access in Arizona. That's a state where it could well make a difference.
They did.
Yeah, that was scary.
And also in thinking about third-party candidates, I think about one of the other things that's shown up in the polls that's sort of eyebrow-raising lately, and that is that Biden has been very weak among young voters, which young voters, we're going to have some of the crystal ball about this later this week, young voters in 2020, about 25-point margin for Democrats or for Biden, across the different kinds of exit polls that you look at. And you also sometimes see that the third-party candidates are attracting more support, at least for the time being, amongst the youngest voters. I mean, what do we make of this weakness for Biden amongst young people? Steve, maybe jump in, and then others can jump in too.
I mean, I think it's a combination of things. There was a New York Times story today about perceptions of the economy breaking sharply along age, where young voters think almost unanimously and uniformly that the economy is headed in the wrong direction, whereas seniors are largely happy with the direction of the economy, which makes them a bit of an outlier when you look at the general population. I think that's part of it. I think over the last couple of months, it's pretty clear that young voters are not as supportive of Israel in the war in the Middle East as older voters are and as the Biden administration has been. I think that has hurt him a little bit. I think there's also just the basic reality that if it is Biden against Trump, whoever wins will be the oldest person to win a presidential race, and that these folks are just, being in their late 70s or early 80s, just really out of touch with young voters. That's not necessary. That part's not necessarily going to change between now and election day, though. As folks who tend to turn out at lower rates and be a little bit more disillusioned with politics, kind of clue in on the election as we get closer to November. Yes. It's possible those numbers will move some, but Kyle, we were talking about this before the panel here. That 25-point margin, even if you look at some polls now, Biden and Trump are essentially tied among this group. Even if you swing that back to a 15-point margin or a 20-point margin, given how close the last election was and how close the polls are now, that could be enough. The same thing is true for other key core Democratic constituencies, like black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters. Any kind of inroads that Trump or Republicans make could be the difference.
That's why they're investing in Spanish language media. Republicans, listen, like I said, I was part of the party for a long time, and political communications is my specialty. And back in 98, 2000, 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, I was part of discussions about the importance of speaking to minority communities before 6 weeks, 6 weeks before an election. You can't just scoop in with a couple of radio ads in local parlance and you think that people are going to listen to you when you haven't established a relationship. Well, the Trump people have gotten a lot better at this. A lot of the Republicans understand the importance of investing in these communities and using certain messages that appeal to them. I mean, Donald Trump won 20% more of the black vote in Philadelphia in 2020. Despite everything that he did and said during his administration for 4 years. Why? there are issues there. Could it be misogyny? It was more black men than black women. But, is it misogyny? Was it the criminal justice reform? Was it jobs? Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of factors. But the point is that same thing at the Latino community in South Texas. Why? Not because of what people think. It's because of jobs, the energy sector, and law enforcement. I spent a lot of time on the border. I worked on border security and immigration when I worked in Congress. Down there along the southern border, a lot of Latino workers work in the oil and gas industry, and a lot of them are law enforcement. And those folks thought that Donald Trump was doing a better job. So now Florida is a different situation, right? It's not monolithic, and South Florida, they all think that Joe Biden and the Democrats are Castro communists and socialists, and they don't want to, relive that, and they've been conditioned into believing that, and Republicans are reinforcing those stereotypes, which we all know is not true, but they're taking advantage of that. Trump did an interview with Telemundo, right? Or was it Univision? Univision, right? With no pushback. What is happening here? He has smarter people surrounding him this time around in the campaign. Barbara knows these folks. Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles. These are seasoned Republican operatives. This is not the cacophony of kooks that he had in 2016 and 2020. So they understand, and they are laying the foundation in areas where some of these margins that he could just, even if it's 1 or 2 percentage points, could make the difference in those key swing states. So Democrats cannot take that for granted.
But then you also probably aren't seeing, like, you all haven't heard the negative things that he is saying too right now.
Right.
About, the negative things he's going to do, the bigotry and the ugly stuff. You haven't heard because there's not that negative ad, constant thing that's going on right now. So
well, yeah,
while
hopefully
they're doing that,
hopefully Democrats will show the concentration camps and things that he wants to do.
Telling you because he's not being covered right now in the way that he used to be. He's just not on TV anymore. So when he's saying kind of a lot of the awful things that he's saying, it's not getting the attention that it used to get.
Just going to do a couple additional questions before we'll break and then get ready for our second part of the program tonight. But Miles, I wanted to ask you, I don't want to ignore down ballot races. Joe Manchin, his name came up earlier. Joe Manchin retired recently. Was the lowest hanging fruit for Republicans to flip a Senate seat. They need just one more, assuming they hold everything else. How uphill is it for Democrats in the Senate at this point?
Yeah, I mean, assuming the Republicans pick off West Virginia, which, we already, even if he was running for re-election, we were the only forecaster who had Manchin as an underdog if he ran. So, really one of the big trends we've seen in Senate races is, just a big alignment between how states vote at the presidential level and what they vote for everything else. I really don't like this as someone who studies trends and coalitions. In 2016, it was the first Senate election ever where every state that had a Senate race voted exactly the same for president as they did for the Senate. In 2020, it wasn't much better. The only crossover member was Senator Susan Collins up in Maine. So where I'm going with this is if this straight party trend persists, to hold the Senate, the Democrats are going to need to win states like Ohio and Montana, which are very likely going to vote for Trump. So, it seems the Republicans have, a bit of an easier path to the Senate. The House, seems more 50-50. It's been interesting watching the House over the past few cycles. It really hasn't behaved as we thought. In 2020, instead of gaining seats like most people thought, the Democrats lost seats. They had a majority of 4 seats. Flash forward to 2022. It was looking like a big Republican year, but the Republicans also won a 4-seat majority in the House. So I think since 2018, the Senate and the House have moved in opposite directions when you look at which party gains in which chamber. I think this year could kind of continue that streak.
Barbara, as a former member of the House, one thing we've seen recently is that just a lot of retirements on both sides of the aisle. Many from politically safe seats, but also some competitive races. Abigail Spanberger, she's not really retiring; she's running for governor of Virginia in 2025, but that's a competitive seat. There are a number of others. Do you, as a former member, do you sort of understand the retirement impulse, or how do you think about it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think there'll be a lot more, and not just in the not just in the safe seats. I think there'll be quite a bit more. Kind of after Christmas, you'll probably see more. I mean, listen, you're gonna the Santos seat. They'll expel him, and then that probably will go
Finally.
to a Democrat. The guy. Blanking on his name, but the Democrats will probably get that back because the guy who retired to run for governor is going to take that back, and then we have another Republican retirement who's going to take a university position, and I think because a lot of Republicans are concerned they might lose, and also because it just is not fun, particularly in the House. I don't know that you're going to see as many more retirements in the Senate, because it looks a little bit more optimistic. But even there, I saw in Montana, Tester has some of the highest popularity, but he's up in the 60s in popularity. So even though, you have that, Trump winning there, he still, Tester's pretty popular, and we could blow it by, giving Rosendale, if he runs, Matt from Maryland, if he gets the nomination, that could, Tester could win. Again, the MAGA problem. But no, I think the retirements are a real problem because it's just miserable, and the people you don't want to retire are the most likely to retire is the problem.
Steve, what's your assessment of House and Senate? You do your own House ratings for Politico.
No, I think Miles hit it on the head here, where now, granted, the Senate, not all the seats are up at the same time, so some of the countervailing trends are sometimes due to the map, and the map this year is obviously tougher for Democrats. Notably, if they lose West Virginia, that basically erases any margin for error, and if they lose the presidency, even if John Tester and Sherrod Brown win re-election, as soon as the new vice president was inaugurated, they would lose control of the Senate, and the Senate would be 50-50. So obviously a really uphill climb there. In the House, there's one big X factor that we're waiting for, and that's potential redistricting in New York. Democrats would love another crack at that map. They've asked the highest court in New York to give them that chance to essentially do what North Carolina Republicans did this year and what Texas Republicans did 20 years ago under Tom DeLay's oversight, and redraw a valid congressional map that had been imposed by a court in the middle of the decade. Democrats want the opportunity to do that in New York. If they do, they could flip 5-6 seats there, and that could be, in what Miles described as a 50-50 race for the House, that could be enough. George Santos' seat will be one of them. No matter what, Tom Suozzi will be the next.
In Alabama, right? Republicans are the seat in Alabama.
Democrats will get one out of Alabama.
Louisiana.
Yeah, and potentially Louisiana, potentially Georgia, potentially Florida, though there's some active litigation there. Those seats may come, they may not, but those are one seat each. Republicans are going to flip probably 3 or 4 in North Carolina based on redistricting. Democrats can kind of erase that advantage if they get a crack at New York. If they don't, it might be Republicans have an opportunity to retain their narrow majority, a good shot at it.
Well, I want to thank our panel and stick around for part 2.
Been a big day in politics, and had a very appropriate funeral for Rosalind Carter. She's a very gracious person, and delighted to see she had a send-off like that with all the living first ladies, even the one. And you give her credit for showing up. She showed up. Wasn't easy, I'm sure. She didn't wear black, but I don't want to get petty.
Hey, anything she can do to get out of the house, I mean.
Well, she was ordered to bring some Happy Meals back, probably. But I didn't say that, and you don't know what I was referring to, so I know you won't tell anybody about that. Anyway, it was a big day, and now it's going to get bigger as we discuss this wonderful, just released book. You're hearing a lot of this for the first time from the author himself, Tired of Winning, and aren't we all, really? I say this after the Virginia Tech game. Aren't we tired
It's
of
exactly
winning?
the context. Yes, that's good.
That's very, very
That was
similar.
a close one, right?
I was very close. It was like 5-4. I don't know what it was, something like that. The subtitle is, and I love this subtitle. I think it should be bigger. Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. And we're going to talk about whether it really is the end, or just the beginning of a more dangerous period in the party's history and American history. But let me introduce John, and then we will go to a bunch of my questions and then a bunch of your questions. So be thinking of what you want to ask. And I might add, this lovely representative of our bookstore is out here, and she's been here all night. She only got to have 2 pieces of pizza because she felt badly. Some of the students look so hungry, and she only ate 2 pieces. And it seems to me you owe her, and the adults, this applies to you doubly because you've got a long Christmas list. Here's your opportunity to clear it up in one night.
Yeah.
Just a box of these books makes a wonderful Christmas gift.
Absolutely.
And for those of you, or Hanukkah, or New Year's, I mean, you could, or, National Potato Week, I don't care what it is. So we expect you to get it, and Glenn, will you man the doors and make sure that they all line up? Because that's going to be the new thing in America.
We
gonna
just
be
had
ordered.
a review of this book. It just came out today. The person said that it should be required reading of everybody who votes in 2024.
I like
so
that.
I was doing the math. I mean, this could be a real big bestseller.
Sure, that's 160 million people.
Yeah.
That's worth, New York Times bestseller list from now until the 22nd century. So that's fantastic. But anyway, it's really it's fascinating, and you think you know all the bad stuff, and you don't. You've just tasted it, and the potential to get worse is obvious to everybody. But I want to introduce John first because we're thrilled to have him back. We had his daughter here for 4 years, Anna. She was a wonderful student. She took the JFK class, which many of these students are in now. And she graduated, it was 2 years ago now? I'm confused. It's incredible. The years just blur. And it will for you all, too. A lot of you are first year. And it just goes like this, right? For those of you who are older, it just goes like that. Anyway, we're thrilled to have him back. He's in his second year as a scholar, but really the most important position at the University of Virginia, scholar at the Center for Politics. I guess there are a couple of administrative positions that pay better, but yes, and Barbara is one too. And you on your second or third year? Yeah, third year. So
Edgar Allan Poe was a scholar.
Edgar Allan Poe was here. I had Jefferson, and then he died on me. He agreed to do it, and he died. It was very upsetting. But don't bring up bad memories like that. Now, Jonathan Karl, is the chief Washington correspondent for ABC News and co-anchor of This Week, and that's relatively new. And I told him I always watch and I record when I'm not here. This Week, and of course, Face the Nation, since it's moderated by Margaret Brennan, UVA graduate. And there's nobody from UVA on Meet the Press, so I don't bother. But you get the other two, you're fine. You can tell them, I don't care. So remember to do that now. We got a UVA connection for This Week. He's the former president of the White House Correspondents Association, and he's reported from the White House under 4 presidents and 14 press secretaries. Really, there should be little pins for each, like they do on military
With
uniforms.
Sean Spicer, you get an extra.
Yeah. No, it should just be vacant. That would be appropriate, or maybe Dancing with the Stars. Jonathan has won several of the most prestigious awards in journalism, and his last 2 books, this is really a trilogy about how the United States is going to hell in a handbasket. And you've got to have all 3. Again, it comes as a package, right, for Christmas and Hanukkah. Front Row, the other 2 books are entitled Front Row at the Trump Show and Betrayal. And both of them went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list immediately, as will this one.
It has.
It has already?
Yeah.
See, that's why I have a crystal ball. I just looked at it, I knew it would happen, and it already happened. You know, sometimes the crystal ball is retrospective. Okay. Okay, now it was released 2 weeks ago. I should have known it was already on the list. So, in any event, it is something we're going to discuss at great length, and I need to mention one other thing because I'll never forget it. January 6th, 2021, which none of you will forget, but by accident, the Center for Politics had the dome room of the rotunda, and we had a long program, hours and hours long. We thought it was simply going to be an opportunity to send an online program to as many Americans as wanted to watch about the incoming administration and the formality of the casting of the electoral vote. Little did we know. And we had John, who was kind of busy that day, lined up for the evening. And while some others had to cancel on us, Tim Kaine had this ridiculous excuse about being locked in a room in the Senate and they took his iPhone. Do you believe that one? I don't believe it. Actually, it was true. It stunned me. But we missed out on some people. But John went out to the lawn of the White House. I was afraid he was going to be arrested.
Yep.
And gave us a blow-by-blow of what had happened that day. And the whole country was stunned, but we were really stunned. In Jefferson's dome room, hearing about the near overthrow of the U.S. government. Who could have imagined something like that happening? And yet it did. It did. And Jonathan, what interests me, I'm going to start off with this. You have written these 3 books, and while they're fair, they're quite critical of Donald Trump. Who could imagine that either? Imagine being critical of Donald Trump. And yet he continues to give you extensive access over and over and over again. Is it that he doesn't read? And we know that's true. He doesn't read. He didn't read his own book, The Art of the Deal, which he didn't write. Is that it? Or is it that you have some mesmerizing impact on Donald Trump?
Well, I have known him since the mid-1990s because I was a young reporter in New York at the New York Post, and he was a guy that I could, on a slow news day, call up. I mean, he'd always take the call. And, hey, you got anything, Donald? We got some space in the paper. He would find something. It was never really particularly serious, I never thought he was I never talked to him about politics, for instance. But so he knew me, and look, I take seriously the idea that a reporter, it is our duty to strive to be objective in as far as we can be, to be fair and balanced, a phrase that Fox used to use but doesn't use so much anymore. But was a tagline when Fox first came on, fair and balanced, and I liked it. That makes sense. They also said, we report, you decide. And I think that's exactly right. So from the very start I covered his campaign in 2016, beginning in 2015, and at the beginning of the White House, I believed that I was going to treat him fairly. Now, fairly doesn't mean fairly means factually. So I don't know if they're negative. If they're negative, it's because the facts are negative. But I think that he sensed that for me, and he knew that I was somebody who had treated him fairly in the past. I was a familiar face out in the crowd. And he would say the nastiest and meanest things about me 1 minute, and then 2 minutes later he'd say, that book was pretty good you did. You actually treated me fair. I had a relationship with him. This is a much darker book. It's hard to say.
Tell us about it.
It's harder to say that it can be darker than betrayal. So this is 3 books. I didn't intend to write 3. But I wrote the first one while I was covering the Trump White House because it was such an extraordinary experience. We had never seen a presidency like this. We had never seen a White House like this. There were a set of issues that were truly unique, I think, for the press. And I was, coming in as the White House press, the White House Correspondents Association president. So the challenges of covering a president who has literally declared you the enemy of the people, a traitor to your own country, who calls you the opposition party and other things that we can't say in mixed company. Really just nasty, vicious, brutal attacks, and yet you still want to cover the guy fairly. And it set up a series of interesting challenges. Different reporters had different approaches to this. Some went toe to toe and made it a little bit, in my opinion, too much about them. I tried to keep it as straight, but call out the facts as they were. So I wrote that book, Front Row at the Trump Show. My point was, what's it like? It wasn't a takedown on Donald Trump. It certainly wasn't a laudatory piece, but what was it like to be at the White House at this moment in American history? And then January 6th happens, and I had actually signed the contract to write the second book on January 4th. I had a different title, which someday I'll tell you.
No, do it now. Everybody's interested now that you brought it up.
But it was primarily based on what had happened in the idea of what had happened in 2020 with COVID, with that insane election, and with Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the election. Remember, January 4th is when. So we hadn't gotten to January 6th, but what I saw was him losing the election not just in November, but losing it day after day after day, all of the court challenges, all of his efforts to get local Republican leaders in the contested states to decertify legitimate election results in their states. Those efforts all failed. The effort to get members of Congress to overturn the election, it was clear it hadn't happened yet. They hadn't met, but it was clear that was going to fail. And then ultimately the effort to get his vice president to overturn it. So that was I wrote that book to document the history of what I saw as the biggest betrayal of American democracy by a political leader of any kind, but especially a president of the United States. And I went and I talked to everybody around him, including him, multiple interviews, and I documented, it is a brutal portrayal. Because the facts were brutal. But this is darker still than that, because this is a look at what happened after he left the White House and a look ahead to what it would be if he returned as president again. And once again, I think it's a very important fact. I just did an interview with Bret Baier on Fox, actually, on this that's supposed to air tomorrow. I haven't done the math on this, but at least 90% of the people that I talked to for this book are Republicans. The vast majority of them are people who served Donald Trump, who supported Donald Trump, many of whom Donald Trump put in very high positions of power and authority and responsibility. And those are the stories. That's where this comes from. This is not a screed from his opponents. This is a factual portrayal of what Donald Trump has done since those dark days before and immediately after January 6th, and what it would look like if he came back.
Well, you're right. This is dark, but it's also accurate, and I hope that eventually Americans will really get it. It's a frightening prospect, and I say that again as somebody who, for years, as you know, also tried to do the fair and balanced thing.
Yes.
You get to a point where you just can't tolerate what's going on, and you realize it's going to get much worse.
Your first obligation as a reporter is to the truth. And I believe that in all my reporting, have strived to be fair. But I know that my work is going to be judged in this period. People aren't going to say 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, were you fair to Donald Trump? They're going to say, did you tell the truth, and did you tell it with absolute clarity?
Well, one place where you gave absolute clarity and where you also backed up what you've been saying from somebody who was in, let's just say, a decently high position, not somebody who was buried in the bureaucracy, and you couldn't identify this individual, understandably. Sometimes reporters have to do that. It's the only way they can get the information they need. And this was, according to your own description, a senior, not a junior, a senior official in the Trump White House who, in discussing Trump with Jonathan for this book, and it's in this book, said, at least in part, he lacks any shred of human decency.
The man was talking about Trump, not me, just to be
No, no.
Just wanted to be clear.
No,
Okay.
we know you. There's
Okay, all right,
you have several shreds.
Good,
I've
good,
seen
good.
you
Okay.
have several shreds
Right,
of human
right.
decency. Trump lacks any shred of human decency, humility, or caring. He is morally bankrupt, breathtakingly dishonest, lethally incompetent, and stunningly ignorant of virtually anything related to governing, history, geography, human events, or world affairs. It's not finished. We're not finished yet. And this is a senior official in the Trump administration. No liberal, right?
No.
Very conservative. Continuing.
Conservative Republican to this day, yes.
He is a traitor and a malignancy in our nation and represents a clear and present danger to our democracy and to the rule of law. Other than that, is there anything bad about him? Or?
So let me give you context on this, because this is important. This is a very senior official in the West Wing who served in the Trump White House for over a year. I can't tell you the exact amount of time because you can start figuring it out because people came and go with some frequency. This individual was there for more than a year, had daily contact with Trump. So this isn't, there was that whole anonymous who came out, turns out to be Miles Taylor, and he was a guy that worked at Homeland Security. No. This is somebody who was with Trump virtually every day for more than a year. Had a position of seriousness and importance in that White House. And I had been interviewing him for this book, a series of conversations, as I did with many people who worked in that White House and people who were with Trump after he left. And this was a kind of a follow-up interview, and I called him right after Jack Smith had put out the indictment on the classified documents case that detailed in exquisite detail not only the way Trump had taken these documents from the White House, their sensitivity, and the carelessness with which he handled them, but also the ways in which he had obstructed justice and tried to prevent first the National Archives and then the Department of Justice from getting these documents back. So this person, as I called, and just wanted to get your just reaction to this latest thing, said, he told me, I was so infuriated when I read that I went to my computer last night and I wrote, a note to myself about it. And I said, really? Well, what did you write? Could you share it with me? And this person shared, so this is what this person wrote, took down and wrote. And you may ask, well, why didn't he put his name to it? Which is a good and very fair question. First of all, this is not somebody who has come out publicly against Donald Trump. So it's not one of the kind of usual suspects that have been out there. It's not somebody it's somebody who has basically checked out of politics and said that the primary reason why he could not put his name to this or any comment to me, this person's name does not, could not appear in this book, anything on the record, because fearful of the retribution that he would face from Trump and from Trump's allies, and not just him, but his family. And we can get to that too, because that's a very real concern and fear, and we've seen people pay dearly for having the temerity to cross Donald Trump. You've had one of them here. She is a backbone made of titanium, and that's Liz Cheney. And she has, she was on a track to be Speaker of the House, and she ended up ultimately not even able to win a Republican primary in her home state of Wyoming. Okay? Now, she's up for it, and she would take back a thing that she's done. Not everybody is willing to, put their lives and their families all on the line. I mean, death threats, all of it. But this is a serious individual, and it gets to something. It's not one person. It gets to what I said. Remember, more than 90% of the people I spoke to for this book, Republicans, most of them at one point close to Donald Trump, most of them hired by Donald Trump at one point or another, is that the most searing criticisms of Trump have come not from the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, although she's got a few of her own, but from the people that have been closest to Trump, the people who have seen him close up and know what it's like when he's in a position of power and authority. And that's an example of that.
John, you covered him throughout his first term. Some people think, well, he learned things in the first term, and so he'll be I can't even utter these words without retching, a better president in the second term. But others say that, in fact, what he learned from the first term is that he wasted a lot of it putting establishment Republicans in high office that he couldn't depend on to lie, cheat, and steal for him during the term and while the votes were being recounted. In the second term, he might be inclined, or would very likely be inclined, to appoint people who are complete puppets and will do exactly what he wants, or are already crazy and oriented to doing all these things anyway. Where do you stand?
I mean, this is a major theme of this book. Look, he will be better in some sense. He does have a sense of how things work to a degree. By the way, let's not exaggerate that. One little anecdote from the Trump, because some of this goes back to stuff I learned from it's not all post-presidency. There is stuff from, to kind of tell the story. I've got a chapter called Team of Sycophants. Abraham Lincoln had a team of rivals. Donald Trump had a team of sycophants. The first cabinet meeting, they went around and all talked about how the dear leader was so wonderful. But even the people around that table who paid homage to the great man ended up, many of them, breaking fabulously with Trump and saying things about him that, again, that would make Nancy Pelosi blush. But he didn't have any idea of what he was doing when he came in. There's a story in the book about he had a meeting with President Xi of China, one of these bilateral meetings, and you've seen these meetings. You have the American side on one side of the table, the Chinese side on the other, and they each have their earpieces in to get the simultaneous translation, and they had carefully gone over with Trump to prepare him for this meeting with President Xi. There were a whole series of meetings. And Trump goes into the meeting and starts just spouting off stuff that has nothing to do with what they were going to do. I don't know, talking about how much Mar-a-Lago is worth or something. Nothing of any substance at all. And this person was so distraught by this that he turned up the translation, the Chinese, because you could switch it American to English, English to Chinese, turned up the Chinese translation so he couldn't, to tune Trump out. This is a member of his delegation. So that's the kind of thing. So there wasn't a lot of competence in that first, but there were people who tried to prevent Trump from doing damage to himself in some cases, and to his party, and to the country in other cases. People who found ways to kind of manage and massage him, take what he wanted, the orders, but then maybe stick him over here and say, what about this, Mr. President? They found ways.
Shiny object.
And there were people like John Kelly, his third chief of staff, who did this. I go kind of chapter and verse in betrayal on some of the very specific ways in which he wanted to go to war with Venezuela at one point. And they, Kelly did some pretty extraordinary things to make sure that particular order never made it to the Pentagon. Now that is defying the orders of the commander-in-chief, thank God. But that kind of stuff happened. Bill Barr refused Trump's orders to use the power of the Justice Department to help overturn the election. His White House counsel, Don McGahn and Pat Cipollone, kept on saying, "You can't do that, Mr. President. It's illegal. We can do this. We can do that instead." His attorneys general, not just Barr, but Jeff Sessions early on refused to fire the special counsel investigating Russian interference in the election. All of this. So Trump, that infuriated him, and he finally realized that these people were kind of, reining him in. So at the end of the Trump administration, he appointed the single most loyal person in that entire White House to him, the guy that carried his bags, John McEntee, a guy who came to work with him in his 20s and was just, whatever you want, Mr. President. He made that guy what they call the director of what they call the Presidential Personnel Office, PPO. The most important human resources department in the entire federal government, responsible for hiring and firing 4,000 political appointees in the executive branch, from cabinet, from the Secretary of State, to the Director of National Intelligence and on down. He put him in charge of that. And McEntee went about conducting basically loyalty tests to find out who was loyal and who wasn't. Now, he didn't have much time because this was the end. This was the last term and it was COVID. But after the election, he really started doing things, firing the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, who refused to invoke the Insurrection Act to bring active duty U.S. forces to put down unrest on American streets during the George Floyd protests. He, went through and fired all those people and started to make sure they were loyal to his place. Well, now a second Trump term starts there.
Exactly.
And, those people who tried to keep him in line with varying degrees of success won't get in the door. The first test will be loyalty. One of McEntee's lieutenants described this and said, it's because they have this project. You've probably heard of it, Project 2025.
Google it.
Yeah, it's out of the Heritage Foundation, which used to be a pretty serious operation.
Used to be.
And it's to set the agenda for the next Republican president. Of course, it's for Trump. And part of it is the personnel, who they would put in. And so one of McEntee's lieutenants, McEntee's advising this. He's now a little older now. He's in his 30s.
Maturity.
Said, look, you're talking about how you hire a good person for your administration. Do you want people that are good on policy, that agree with your agenda, all that kind of stuff? And he said, the funny thing is, you can teach policy, but you can't teach loyalty. So we're hiring for loyalty, and then we'll worry about the policy later. The first question is, will you obey and carry out the wills of the man?
Of Donald Trump from day one.
Yep.
Right. He won't be wasting 2.5 years as he did in his first term, which is bad news for all of us if he actually gets into office. Wholly apart from philosophy or ideology or what you think ought to be done on immigration. We're talking about...
There's actually very little philosophy and ideology in this.
No, it's about control.
Yeah, it's about
just
control.
all about control and power. That's all it is. And I want to ask you, I want to go back to January 6th for a minute because it's so critical to understanding what Trump may do in a second term. To what degree did you and other members of the White House press, covering him daily and having great contacts in the building, to what degree did you really sense that there would be a coup attempt as opposed to just a demonstration?
I'll be totally honest with you. I was absolutely shocked that it turned out that way. For one thing, there were a couple of demonstrations that happened earlier. There was December 12th, right? The one in Washington, which featured a whole cast of the most extreme characters. Like Michael Flynn was there and company. And I was out on the streets for that. There were some clashes between Antifa and Trump, fanatical Trump supporters. Some people got hurt, but it was pathetic. in terms of the number of people. And I was like, okay, I mean, this is not really turning out too much. And also, when the states each had to get together to certify their electoral votes on December 8th, there were protests, in Lansing, Michigan. There were protests out in Arizona. There were protests at the various state capitals. And they were pathetically small. There wasn't much, and there was no violence and all that. So I thought it was ending with a petering out. And I was totally wrong. First of all, just by the size of that contingent of Trump supporters that came into town. And then the thing that really struck me immediately, even before the violence took place, but just that sheer movement of people up to the Capitol, was I was looking out at the crowd and I was seeing all these people carrying flags. And I was going to go to a lot of parades and protests and patriotic things, and they weren't American flags, they were Trump flags.
No.
This was not a protest for American values, it was a protest for Trump values. I mean, look at the pictures. I mean, there are some people that had American flags. There are some people that had Confederate flags. We can know about that. But I mean, this was by and large it was all about Trump. It was all about a man. So I was shocked and horrified. I had a series of conversations that day. When I talked to you, I was at the White House because I went to the White House once. I wanted to figure out what the hell he was doing. That was during that period. Like, where's the president? By the way, in this book, I have an email that I finally sent. It was one of like many, many emails, but it was a culmination that I sent to Kayleigh McEnany. Remember her?
Oh, yeah.
The White House press secretary. I told you I dealt with 14 of them. Right? I think she was number 14. And the subject line is, "Note to the National Archives." Didn't know the archives would become a story in all of this, but I know that presidential records, including emails to officials, go to the National Archives that are eventually released. What, the first round is in 5 years? Is that what it is?
Supposedly.
Or become available for FOIA requests and whatnot. So, note to the National Archives, and I said, and it was sent to her. I said, let this email be an official documentation that I have sent dozens of emails, text messages, and I have made several phone calls to the White House press secretary on this incredibly pivotal time in our nation's history, as there is an insurrection up on Capitol Hill, and she has not responded once. I mean, you couldn't find out. So not only was the president completely MIA while this was going on, his staff were completely MIA.
Well, that's frightening. And
that's why I called you, because I couldn't talk to,
Yeah, you couldn't tell. Well, sure, I was last on the list, but I'm glad I was on the list. It's okay.
No,
to be
it
last.
was so revolting. And I write in the conclusion of this book, which is the hardest thing I've ever written. And I did the audio book on this, and when it came time to read it, it was hard to get through without seriously just kind of breaking up, because what that symbolized. I've had the great privilege to do the job that I've wanted to do since I was in like 5th grade, to be a reporter and to cover world events. And I spent years as a reporter in covering Congress, going into that building, and it never once was I not in awe, walking in, looking at that dome and having a chance to go, no matter how sometimes the stories could be crummy and the individuals could let you down, but just knowing that I was there and had an opportunity to see, American democracy in action, and then to do the same thing as I became a White House reporter, sort of the idea of seeing those people trample into that building, breaking through, shattering glass, marring breaking into the Senate floor and rummaging through the desks of the senators. Those desks and I've been on the floor of the Senate just a handful of times, because they don't allow us measly reporters to go there unless there's a reason. But I've been on that Senate floor, and I'm like, this is like It's
Sacred.
both a it's sacred ground.
Yeah.
And each one of those desks, there's a record of which senators have sat in those desks. And for they many of them put their initials in. That there was the original doorkeeper, this Isaac Bassett, who was in charge of kind of keeping the records for a while, would go through and erase the initials once the senators left because they were torn. Now of course it's a great
honor.
But to see those people rummaging through there and leaving a threatening note to the vice president on the presiding officer, this was horrifying to me.
Well, John,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go off on.
Well, we're interested in that. Although I think to balance that, they were just tourists. I think that's become increasingly obvious.
That's another reason that was a reason to write Betrayal, but I didn't anticipate that the revisionist history would go so insanely off track. I mean, it was already starting a little bit, but with it, I mean, the idea that people witnessed this with their own eyes. These were people that were on the House floor barricading the doors to keep the mob from getting in.
And hiding.
Getting prepared to, a couple of them like Mark Wayne Mullen and Troy Nels and these guys who they broke off, the hand sanitizers were there because it was COVID. They broke the stanchions so they would have a thing to fight back against the mob. These guys knew what was going on. And now some of the same people that were there are saying it was no big deal.
Well, they're worried about the retribution which is coming. As Trump has been honest about it. If he's ever been honest about anything, and there isn't a long list, but he's been honest about the fact that he is going to seek retribution, probably in some illegal ways. But beyond that, what's truly shocking is how few people have been willing to speak out, even those who are retired and are out of politics. Just to mention, Liz Cheney was here on Monday doing CBS Sunday Morning, which is coming up on this Sunday, about her new book. And what I thought was so fascinating was George W. Bush, who, remember, her father was Bush's vice president. He was out of politics completely. He hated Trump. All the Bushes hated Trump. Trump screwed George P. Bush in Texas, among others. Okay? I mean, there were a lot of reasons. And Bush never said a word except to Liz, he wrote, "There's been a great deficit of courage in this country," referring to Trump.
Yeah.
But you are the exception. Keep it up. And he signed at 43, his number of the presidency.
Yep.
Where was the public statement? Where was the public statement from all of these people? Where? I'm asking you.
No, it's a really good point, and I'll tell you the calculation that a lot of them have made, and I haven't talked to George W. about this, but I guarantee you it's the calculation he made, is a feeling that not only would it not have an impact, but it might backfire, because Trump made an asset out of the fact that he had that he had angered the Bushes. I mean, I remember I did an interview with Trump in 2014 before, almost a full year before he came down that escalator. And he said, "We've had enough Bushes." This is before he got in. He's like, because Jeb
was in there.
So I think, but I mean, come on, you're the former president of the United States. Come out and tell us what you think. I mean, so many of those who did saw that their words had very little impact and saw themselves effectively thrown into political exile. I mean, there were some. I mean, well, one of them was Rick Perry, who called Trump a cancer on conservatism. Didn't work out so well, so, within a year, he was a full-on Trump supporter. He embraced cancer. Served in his cabinet. I mean, go back and look at that. You can Google that too. That was one of the most powerfully anti-Trump statement. This was Perry. It's no secret, although it seemed like it at the time, that he ran for president in 2016, and didn't go very well. And when he dropped out, he gave this incredibly powerful speech of the dangers of Trumpism, and then he became as blindly subservient to him as just about anybody.
You'd think that conscience would have an impact.
But that's not the. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but you had.
Go ahead.
But you're asking what the people that stood back who knew this and just remained silent. And I don't have a good answer to that. I conclude with a. I'm going to say tribute to those who did have the courage to stand up, because there are a number of them. Liz is obviously one of them.
Romney, Kinzinger.
Yeah, but there are people like Rusty Bowers, who was the Republican Speaker of the House in Arizona, as conservative a guy as you can possibly imagine, who simply refused to break the law when Rudy Giuliani and Trump himself asked him, just decertify that election result in Arizona, change it, whatever, it doesn't matter what the vote said, and he refused. And this guy, his life was turned upside down, and again, he lost a Republican primary, and he's now. Out of office. He was the Speaker of the House.
Speaker of the House.
In Arizona. And he's never wavered. And I've been out there twice to see him in Arizona. I've covered him when he testified before the January 6th committee. Just a good, decent human being who did not hesitate to do the right thing. And that's the model. Of course, it's all too many didn't take that model.
And people like that are leaving office. Some of them were defeated, but others are saying it's not worth it. And they're
Senator
leaving.
Cassidy is not
Yeah.
running. I mean, you've got Romney.
Exactly.
Yep.
That brings up, what might happen in the future. And you've mentioned this throughout your books, and then the current one, again, tired of winning. We'll get to your questions in just a second. But it's hard to say we were fortunate, but we were fortunate.
We were.
In some ways, all right? I'm certainly not a big fan of Jeff Sessions or Bob Barr or
Bill Barr.
Bill Barr.
I know you're not a fan
Bob
of Bob Barr
yeah,
either.
Bob Barr.
right?
I forgot about
That's
it.
a
From
different-
Georgia, Congress.
That's a
Exactly. I'm sorry. Apologize, Bill. That'll be the only time I ever apologize to you. Esper, who did quit, and Kelly, and so and actually Pence. We've had Pence here a couple of times, and I know the stories have been coming out the last couple of days, and they're true.
Yeah.
That he was wavering back and forth.
But he did the right thing at the right moment.
He
and-
did it at the end after saying the day before, I don't think I'm going to show up because this is just going to be too difficult. Well, then don't be vice president if you don't want to show up. But we had these people here who actually did things to make sure that Trump didn't succeed. Mark Milley. What happens in the second term when he picks a complete puppet as vice president? When he picks
Kash
puppets for
Patel
the
is your
Senate?
Secretary of Defense.
Oh, God.
Rick Grinnell is your God
Oh,
knows what.
Jesus.
Yeah.
We fight on Twitter, so I know what you mean.
Oh, I muted him.
Oh,
a long
yes.
time ago.
Yeah, I blocked him. So we don't fight. I love
I like to mute. That way they keep doing it and they think you're getting your attention, but you're like,
No, I like to block. I'm Italian.
okay, all right. You're gonna do
It's kind of a threat.
Yeah.
Lets them know what's coming. Look, I want to go to your questions, and as you are thinking about what you want to ask, remember, tired of winning. This, I think, you see what he knows, and he's just giving you the tippy top of the iceberg. And here's the iceberg, and you really need to get this book, and you need to tell all your relatives and all your friends, especially if you want to leave tonight. I'm just being honest with you. That's the way we are, and
Yeah, no, I
my
appreciate
broader
that.
family.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get some questions. Yes, one of our campaign students.
So it's pretty well known that Trump says a lot of outrageous and negative things.
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Do you believe that the media reporting on this and sort of talking about these negative things, maybe somewhat uncritically, sort of signal boosted Trump and brought him a lot of attention and maybe a lot of support, especially early on in 2016?
Yeah, we were discussing this before we got started. It's a really good question, and it's a really interesting dilemma. If it were just an academic exercise, it would be better. But when the fate of the free world depends on it, it makes it a little bit harder to deal with. The question is, how do you handle it when Donald Trump says completely outrageous and offensive things? And I think that there was, as you say in your question, in 2015 and 2016, he just got a platform and he said it. He was doing interviews everywhere. He was saying stuff, some stuff that just wasn't true, some stuff that, whether it was true or not, was wildly outrageous and offensive. And, people would condemn it. Oh my God, can you believe what he did? Play it again so I can hear it. And the message got amplified. And he built a following. then you get to 2020 and January of 2021, and he's finally leaving office, and you have an entirely different approach, which is we're gonna ignore that guy. I mean, let him, like, he's off Twitter, Fox isn't interviewing him anymore. He's, completely ignore the dude. And I certainly was sympathetic to that. I mean, I never unfollowed him on Twitter because I felt, this is even before he got thrown off, but I definitely turned off the notifications, like after the election. I don't need to hear this anymore, unless I want to go and, now, fast forward to where we are, and he's the front runner for the Republican nomination, and some people are still in that mode of let's ignore him for what you are suggesting in your question. We don't want to give him a platform to make these outrageous statements. Well, guess what? You better know what the hell he's saying. You better listen to what he's talking about doing if he's going to be president again. We can't ignore it. How many of you are aware that just recently he referred to the January 6th prisoners, the people that are in prison for attacking Capitol police officers and breaking into the Capitol building, that he called them not prisoners but hostages? How many of you know about that? I mean, I don't know how much attention that got, but he did that.
And patriots. He called them all patriots.
He said repeatedly he'll pardon them all, but he said that referred to them as hostages. That he referred to his political opponents as vermin. Maybe you caught that one. That got some attention. Those of you who have taken some history classes know what what that means.
Heil, 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 heil.
So I think that I am completely sympathetic to the idea that he got too much of an uncritical access to a wide variety of platforms as a presidential candidate back in 2015 especially, in 2016. But I think we are in an entirely different mode now, and I think we better be paying attention to what he's saying.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, kind of going off of that question, you're obviously a man that is very fond of words, very much, and we've seen how Donald Trump doesn't really know when to shut his mouth, but he's changed so much of political speeches and political rhetoric. How do you see that playing for like the future of the Republican Party and perhaps this 2024 upcoming election?
I mean, what I deeply worry about is not so much, the rhetoric is worrisome and all of that, but that he has demonstrated to some people that you can completely lie and there'll be no price to pay. In fact, it'll work to your advantage. You can say things that are just not true. And if you say them over and over again, if you say them enough, people will believe it. That you can deny that you can call up down, that you can, deny that it's nighttime, if that's in your interest, and it just doesn't matter. And I really, really worry about that because the damage he has done will outlast him. And, there's one example of how Trumpism doesn't need Trump to exist is the mess we've seen in the House. Because he has been a bit player in all of it. At the beginning, Kevin McCarthy in the 15 rounds, he kind of endorsed McCarthy, and then briefly, as I document here, liked the idea that maybe I'll be Speaker of the House, and that wasn't going anywhere.
Then he found out it was work.
Yeah. I mean, he was not a factor, and yet he was everything. It was because of him. These were his acolytes, who were carrying this out, and I think you've seen it again with the downfall of McCarthy, the rise of Mike. And he's not really a factor in any of it, and yet it's all an outgrowth of him.
Because they don't want to cross him, and they fear his retribution.
Yeah.
Who's next? Oh, okay, go ahead. We can't hear you.
Hi.
that better?
Good.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, how should appointees or potential appointees balance the competing ethical demands of, on the one hand, calling out Trump's frankly evil misbehavior when they see it, and on the other, not being publicly critical so as to remain enough on his good side to be more of an adult in the room than the other crazy people that he would replace them with?
I mean, it's a real. It was. I don't know what the second term is going to look like because of all the reasons we've just discussed. But during the Trump presidency, you did have people, Republicans, who declared from the outset, "I am never going to serve that guy. I'm not going to sacrifice my moral principles by serving somebody like that." Especially in the national security space, there was that whole list of the most prominent names in Republican national security who signed a letter during the campaign saying they'd never have anything to do with him,
Right.
and most of them stuck to it.
Well,
But you did have some good and serious people that went to work for him and stayed with him even as he was doing really outrageous things, including after January 6th. There were some people, including a few cabinet secretaries, who resigned in protest. And sometimes you want to applaud when somebody's resigning in protest. That I don't abide by this. I'm walking out the door. But thank God there were some who didn't do that, who stayed there until the end. There was a guy, for instance, named Chris Liddell. Many of you probably never heard of him, but he was a senior official who came from the business world, not really a political guy at all, brought in by Jared Kushner, actually. And he was put in charge of the transition before the election, because there's always somebody that's put in charge. There's actually a Presidential Transition Act, there's somebody who basically makes preparations for what a second term would look like. So it could be a transition to a second term or a transition to the other party if they lose. And Liddell conducted what I've called a clandestine operation out of the second floor of the West Wing after the election to ensure that there were certain basic things that were done to prepare for the Biden administration to come through, working with the incoming Biden team. Trump didn't know a damn thing about it. If he had, he probably would have fired the guy immediately.
at the least.
But he stayed, and thank God he stayed. He's a decent human being and a serious person, and he stayed. Pat Cipollone came very close to resigning. He was the White House counsel at the end. If he had resigned in protest, he was the one guy that was pleading, don't break any more laws. And he stayed. So, and yes, you did have people who tried to placate Trump and you don't want to get too crossways because then you don't have any influence anymore. But I think that what happened with too many Republicans is they went so far in that direction, well, we can't upset him because we won't have any influence over him. There was a guy named Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah, I remember him.
And I write about him in Betrayal. I known him for a long time, know him very well. Really kind of considered, friend. Outside of politics, I've known him for a long time. And then he, suddenly finds himself the Republican leader. And I saw him on January 2nd of 2021 when, walking on the mall. And this was a crazy day in American history, by the way. It was the day of the Raffensperger call, when Trump called Raffensperger and said, find me 11,280 votes or whatever it was. And it was the day that the Justice Department officials all threatened to resign en masse if Trump inserted Jeffrey Clark. I mean, it was really quite a day in American history. It was a Saturday. And I see McCarthy, and I go up and we walk down the mall, beautiful, National Mall, towards the Lincoln Memorial. I put a photo in the book of the two of us wearing masks because it was the middle of COVID in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And I was kind of pleading with him. I mean, it's stepping a little bit outside the bounds of what a journalist would normally do, but I felt like this was I was like, you have an opportunity. You can go, you know, they're gonna, you know, certify this election on the 6th. And he hadn't taken a position yet about challenging the electoral votes. He hadn't said how he was gonna go on that. I said, this is your chance to get up there and say it's all bullshit. And congratulate Joe Biden and declare that this entire effort to pretend there was a massive fraud and the election was stolen is all completely unfounded, which of course McCarthy knew. And I said, you could really take a stand. And you're the Republican leader. You're the Republican leader in the House where this is all emanating from. You can actually have an impact. What you say actually can really matter. And I was really laying it on thick to him, and because he was like, he wasn't telling me what he was going to do, but he wasn't. And I said, you know, and if it's powerful enough, maybe they'll put a statue of you out here someday. As we're walking by, like, you know, the Jefferson Memorial and stuff. And he said to me, oh yeah, where's the statue of Jeff Flake? Where's the statue of Bob Corker? These were the two senators who stood up to Trump early on and were awarded by being exiled from the Republican Party. Had no impact and influence him. And his point was that he had done things to keep Trump from doing truly bad things. Not this.
Yeah, that's a joke.
And he had some examples. You remember when Trump threatened to veto the COVID relief bill at the very end, around Christmas time? He put out a statement. You know, his Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, had negotiated this whole thing. Huge deal, COVID relief bill, massive, one of the biggest spending bills, you know, in the history of mankind, and really important. And it had all been negotiated by his people, and he's, I'm going to veto it. And it was McCarthy who got on the phone with him and like talked him off the ledge and convinced him to sign it. So he's like, you know, by keeping close to him, by not alienating him, you know, I can keep him from doing things that are truly bad. And look where it ended up.
Yeah, that's really worked.
Yeah.
Strategy.
4 days later, we had
really worked.
January 6th. And McCarthy, believe it or not, did not take my advice.
No.
In fact, this is like an amazing thing that I don't think has gotten. Barbara Comstocks over here knows this, but I don't think enough people realize the insignificance of this. The assault on the Capitol happens. You know, McCarthy and Pelosi and Schumer and all the leadership have to get rushed out for their lives. The vice president hanging out in the basement surrounded by Secret Service because the mob is trying to kill him. They finally clear out the whole building of the rioters. And in one of the great moments of leadership, the congressional leadership brings the Congress back. And they start doing what they had been doing, counting the electoral votes. So what does McCarthy do? He still votes to challenge the electoral votes. He still votes to toss out the electoral votes. After that, Liz Cheney has a thought or two on this.
Yes.
Because what Liz was doing was going to all the Republicans that were objecting and saying, okay, now the gig is up. We've seen the violence. You can't do this anymore. We're coming back. Let's unite as a country and say this was a horrible mistake. And there were senators, not all of them, but of the senators who were objecting, who said, that's it, I'm dropping my objections.
Lindsey Graham.
Well, he wasn't one of the objectors, but yeah, he said I'm dropping Trump. That lasted about 8 hours.
Yeah, that's right.
But the fact that McCarthy himself comes back and still votes to throw out the electoral votes from Pennsylvania.
You know, they don't care about history. They're going to be dead. They'll be dead.
So the other thing is, and I'm sorry I'm going on this.
No, we're all
apparently no statue plans for Kevin McCarthy on the wall.
Well, you know what? We've got a lot of Play-Doh here at the University of Virginia, and
you guys like statues here, I know.
I'm going to put one in Pavilion 4, a little Play-Doh statue. Let him know. Yeah. That's not me. Yeah, we got one more. Okay, I know we gotta wind up, and then I'll probably ask Barbara Comstock if she's got a final comment too. Congresswoman. Okay. Go
One
ahead.
of the Republican profiles encouraged by that.
Well, she is.
Never
absolutely.
wavered
And I
at
should have
first
mentioned
row.
you in that roll call, but you've already had your time. You know? Okay, go ahead.
Is this
Who is
on?
it?
Can you hear me right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. You mentioned Rick Perry saying that Trump was a cancer to conservatism. So, kind of on an ending note, how do you think we can, like, is there a cure to the cancer in the Republican Party right now? And if so, what is it?
So I think that I'm actually, despite what I just ticked through, I'm actually still optimistic. Maybe it's by nature. And part of what makes me optimistic is what Larry mentioned, which is, you know, the people that stood up and did the right thing at the most important moment. At the end of the Trump administration, some of which you would never have anticipated would have played those, in some cases, quite courageous roles. And I also, I've been to many, 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 more than I can count, Trump events over the years around the country. And, you know, I know that even at his rallies, which is where you see the most hardcore supporters, most of those people are not truly signed up to a dark campaign of retribution and vengeance, and, you know, the total power of one man. I think, you know, a lot are there because they see him as the image that he's projected over the years. I'm the super successful businessman. I'm not afraid to take on the, you know, the powers that be. I'm fighting for you. They never fought for you. A lot of people who believe that the political system has not served them well, and see him as a disruptor. And so I think that not everybody is signed on to that dark, we're going to destroy the vermin system, you know, our idea. And I think that there are genuinely good people. So how does it happen? I don't know. I mean, one thing I have said, and I don't know what your crystal ball is, you'll probably throw me off the carpet here, but I don't think the Republican primary is over.
No,
I mean, I'm pretty sure nobody's
agree with
voted yet.
Yeah.
And
Well, the phony ballots, of course,
phony ballots are already in. The
They're in
Chinese and
rooms
the
all
bamboo-
over. The
yeah, yeah.
Chinese, the Venezuelans, they got tons of them.
I don't think it's a given that he's the Republican nominee, and I'll tell you that will be quite a moment if you know, Nikki Haley or Chris Christie pulls off some kind of a crazy miracle. If something like that happens, Trump will. I don't think he's going to concede.
That's my guess. Yeah, I agree with you.
I mean, I don't want to.
know it's going to be fraud.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, if he loses the Republican nomination, he will go on a total scorched earth campaign to destroy whoever wins and to destroy what is left of the party. And that will be an opportunity to build anew.
And it's Biden's best chance to get reelected, oddly. If it isn't, because Trump being nominated, he's doing better than anybody thought he possibly could. And I know a lot of things can unfold.
Yeah, because Trump will do everything in his power to be ensure that whoever the Republican
is loses. That's what I say. That's Biden's best shot at reelection, because it ain't looking real good right now. But we're a year away. All right, now, Congresswoman, I want you to wrap this up and put a big holiday bow on it. She's a great person, one of our scholars. Did I mention that? At the Center for Politics.
Thank you. Well, guys, first of all, I did read the whole book, so I highly recommend getting it. So do rush and buy this.
Excellent.
Secondly, buy Liz Cheney's book, too. Another person that I know you mentioned in here, Cassidy Hutchinson, since there's so many young people here, do know what a difference you all can make, because the person who did break open those January 6th hearings was a young person who saw, a young woman who saw Liz Cheney running these hearings, who decided to come forward. And since it's only going to be a few states that make a difference, please talk to everybody you know in Pennsylvania, of course in the primaries, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. But the lesson of January 6th and how the country was saved was a few good people in a few states made a difference. And this year, it's going to be people reporting on this, people standing up. Hopefully that person that wanted to be anonymous maybe would turn that little thing he said into a 30-second ad at some point. So anybody you know who can go forward and do something in those key states, because it's going to be those few people, those profiles and courage that are going to make a difference. It doesn't need to be that many people, because it was the few people who saved us, from Trump last time, and we need to be saved from him this time. So thank you. And thank you, Jonathan,
that
for
is
a
excellent.
great 3 books. Read all 3 of them. They're great.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Great to be on
That was great. That was good. We're happy to have you back. All right, a storm is coming, and we've got a good meteorologist here, and you'll be meteorologist too once you read this. So line up and pull out those credit cards. And Mr. Stroop back there, Mr.
Happy to
Stroop,
sign some if anybody
he's
wants.
going to sign.
I'll sign if anybody.
That doubles the value, on eBay. So there you go. You can make your money back. Anyway, that was great.